This is TLC Elementary School, a place where teachers of kindergarten through 6th grade can find high-quality documentary programs chosen to inform and delight students. Tape the show every week and build a comprehensive video library of exceptional material designed to complement your classroom teaching. On this edition of TLC Elementary School, travel back in time to early America. First, take a midnight ride with Paul Revere and the Minutemen. Then, meet George Washington and the Continental Army. Listen to the words of Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. Learn about the American craft of sugaring. Hop on board and explore the history of trains. Then, discover modern-day cowboys. And finally, witness the tragic Trail of Tears. Stay tuned for classroom activities right after the programs. Segment 1, Paul Revere and the Minutemen.
(1775). The American colonies began to embrace the idea of independence from England. But the king would not be disobeyed, so he sent troops to America to enforce his rule. A confrontation was inevitable, and the midnight ride of Paul Revere would change the course of history. On the night of April 18, 1775, 800 British soldiers or regulars marched to the small town of Concord, Massachusetts. General Thomas Gage, the commander of the British forces in Boston, sent them to capture the weapons held by the colonial troops, or Minutemen. But the secret order was passed to colonial spies, who began to send warning across the countryside. Around 10 o'clock, 2 lanterns glowed briefly in the steeple of Boston's Old North Church. This signaled colonists across the Charles River that the British soldiers would travel by water. Colonial leader Dr. Joseph Warren called for Paul Revere and William Dawes to spread news of the march to Lexington to warn the Minutemen and their leaders that they were in danger. Dawes left by land and slipped through the guarded roads of Boston. Paul Revere left by boat.
About 10 o'clock, Dr. Warren begged that I would immediately set off for Lexington. 2 friends rowed me across the Charles River. They landed me on the Charlestown side, went on to the town, and there got a horse. The moon shone bright.
Around midnight, Paul Revere reached the small town of Lexington and shouted, "The regulars are coming!"
Paul Revere didn't say the British are coming because the colonists regarded themselves as British. They were British citizens who lived in America, but they were certainly British citizens. So Revere and the other dispatch riders said the regulars are coming, or the redcoats are coming.
The town bell rang and Minutemen, soldiers ready at a minute's notice, headed for the Lexington Green. For an hour, 130 Minutemen stood ready, but no regulars appeared. It seemed the alarm was false. Parker let the men go to wait for the next alarm, and about 30 waited at Buckman Tavern. Because the British officers did not want to be seen before daybreak, their soldiers were marching fast, a mile every 16 minutes. Inside Buckman Tavern, all was quiet. But around 4:30 in the morning, a scout arrived with news that the regulars were less than half a mile away. By 5 o'clock, about 100 British soldiers marched towards the Lexington Green. Captain Parker gathered his men, now less than 80, and gave his orders.
Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here.
The Minutemen heard British Major John Pitcairn yell, "Lay down your arms!" Outnumbered, Captain Parker told his men to abandon the green. Then, a shot rang out.
This is a revolutionary situation in which literally everything changes, not merely in the course of a single day, but almost in the course of a single minute. Long as it takes to fire the guns and the soldiers drop dead, everything has changed.
In the chaos, the regulars charged forward, blindly thrusting their bayonets and ignoring their officers' orders. At last, the drums brought the soldiers back into line, and they continued their march to Concord, where they were supposed to go in the first place. The British found they had only one man wounded, a private shot in the thigh. For the families in Lexington, 8 men lay dead, 10 others were wounded. The survivors shouldered their muskets and set off toward Concord. By daybreak on April 19th, news of the British march had spread to virtually every town within 20 miles of Boston. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the regulars reached Concord and searched for weapons. The soldiers found 3 cannons, some flour, and 500 pounds of musket balls. A mile and a half north of Concord, about 100 British soldiers were guarding a small bridge. On the hill above them, hundreds of angry Minutemen gathered and waited. They were constantly being joined by men from neighboring towns. They made no move, only waited to observe the situation. While the regulars searched Concord, the blacksmith shop and the courthouse were set on fire. It's not known who set the blaze, but the smoke rising above the town alarmed the Minutemen, now numbering over 400 men. The colonists assumed their homes were being burned. "Will you let them burn the town?" the soldier cried. The answer was no. As the Minutemen approached the North Bridge, the British fired. Minuteman John Butcher shouted, "Fire, fellow soldiers! For God's sake, fire!" In the exchange of gunfire, 2 Minutemen were killed, but 4 British officers were wounded and 3 enlisted men lay dead. The regulars fell back and prepared to return to Boston. To the angry Minutemen, it looked like a retreat and an opportunity. Using a shortcut, the Minutemen reached a crossing called Merriam's Corner ahead of the British soldiers. Taking cover behind houses, fences, and trees, they waited for the British soldiers to march into their trap.
Before we'd gone half a mile, we were fired on from all sides. Lieutenant John Barker.
At sundown, the British soldiers reached Boston. More than 270 British soldiers were wounded, missing, or dead. The midnight ride of Paul Revere signaled the beginning of the Revolutionary War against England, and with the first gunshots, the hope of peace with England vanished. For both sides, there was no turning back.
To complement Paul Revere and the Minutemen, TLC Elementary School suggests the following activity. Have students draw a picture of a typical colonial Minuteman. What kind of equipment did he carry? Create your own class Minutemen encampment on a bulletin board. Segment 2, George Washington and the Continental Army.
Ability to lead an army. Experienced in battle. Of strong moral character. This might have been the job description for the most important position filled in 1775. Finding this man would be the first major accomplishment for the Second Continental Congress. In 1775, Congress created the Continental Army, a force that could protect American interests from British attack. But finding the man to lead this army was a challenge. Many of the colonists had experience in battle. They had fought under British command in the French and Indian War. But these soldiers were not allowed to rise to high-ranking positions within the army. This left few well-trained men to lead the colonists as they faced the world's most powerful war machine, the British Army. But one man inside Congress knew who should lead them. Massachusetts delegate John Adams called for a strong and trustworthy leader, one who could bring his country victory. But more importantly, Adams knew that this man would have to unite the independent colonies. On June 14th, Adams began to describe his ideal candidate.
A gentleman from Virginia who is among us here, and very well known to all of us. A gentleman with skill and experience as an officer, independent fortune, great talents, and excellent universal character.
John Adams could only be describing one man, George Washington of Virginia. To remind Congress of his military experience fighting for the British, Washington wore his uniform from the French and Indian War. During that war, Washington wanted to be an officer in the British Army, but because he was a colonist, it was difficult to advance to a high position. So Washington put aside his military aspirations and for more than 10 years managed his estate, Mount Vernon. Now, just before the Revolution, Washington saw the opportunity to renew his military dream.
George Washington was a very unlikely choice. There weren't a lot of other choices. The Americans didn't have a very strong military tradition separate from the British. You know, it was a society that was a part of the British Empire. I think George Washington maybe wasn't the greatest military figure in the world or the greatest man for the job at the time. But I think the greatness of the man was his ability to sort of promote himself as the best man for the job at a time when they needed somebody to do that. They were all brand new to the game. They didn't know where they were going. He had the great moxie, you know, to show up at the Continental Congress and be his own PR. He said, I'm here, I can do the job. Looking back at it a couple centuries later, it was a great choice. But at the time, I mean, it was a crapshoot.
As George Washington traveled from Philadelphia to Boston to take command of the Continental Army, crowds came out to cheer the first American commander-in-chief. And he looked every inch the general. He was a talented horseman, and his uniforms had been expensively tailored to emphasize his powerful physique.
Understand, in an era when maybe the average male might have come in at around 5'8" and maybe about 145 or 150 pounds, George Washington was 6'3", 225. He could have played linebacker in the NFL. He understood how to use that commanding physical presence to provide the moral authority, and he worked almost all his life at enhancing that image.
George Washington knew his enemy was a highly disciplined group. Armed with the finest weapons and equipment, the men of the British Army were professional soldiers. Most colonial soldiers weren't well equipped and lacked military training. Washington had to transform these farmers and blacksmiths into an army. The Continental Army would experience many difficult times before the end of the war, but Washington's courage and dedication enabled him to lead his army to victory. And without Washington, the American colonists might never have won the Revolutionary War.
To complement George Washington and the Continental Army, TLC Elementary School suggests the following activity. Have students look in newspapers and magazines and on the internet for people who exhibit qualities of a leader. Post copies of articles and pictures on a bulletin board in your classroom. Segment 3, Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence.
In 1775, the American colonies entered a war in which they risked everything for freedom. But a crucial element was missing, a formal Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. In January of 1776, news arrived from England that King George III was sending an army to crush the growing revolution. In Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress, made up of representatives from each state, wanted peace with England. But in June of 1776, the Second Continental Congress looked for a bolder move. On June 7, 1776, Delegate Richard Henry Lee of Virginia announced
that these united colonies are free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown.
They wish to make a declaration of independence, not only for the sake of the civilian population who would see this break, would realize what it was for and would support it, but perhaps above all, for foreign opinion, so that other countries could formally note that these colonies had set up their own independent government and therefore, crucially, could negotiate with foreign governments, could contract alliances, and could receive aid.
The Congress appointed a 5-man committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. Included were Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, John Adams from Massachusetts, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, Robert Livingston from New York, and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. The committee unanimously asked Jefferson to write the draft. At 33, Jefferson was the youngest man on the committee. He'd been active in politics from an early age and was a practicing lawyer by the time he was 24. During 2 hot June days and nights, in his second-story rented apartment, Jefferson bent over his portable writing table to pen the first draft of the Declaration. The document officially stated the position of the American revolutionaries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. After 2 days of debate, the Continental Congress passed the Resolution for Independence. On the 4th of July, 1776, the President of Congress, John Hancock, was the first to sign the document. Once the declaration was submitted to the King, the colonies were committed to the Revolution. The members of Congress made changes to Jefferson's draft, but most of his original work survived. 13 separate English colonies now called themselves the United States of America. Jefferson's ideas, though magnificent, stemmed from other modern philosophers. He borrowed from his Virginia neighbor George Mason, who had borrowed from the 17th century British writer John Locke. Locke wrote that people by nature had certain rights and duties, including liberty, life, and ownership of property. Locke also believed that people should decide who governs them. Just weeks earlier, in the preamble to the Virginia Constitution, Mason wrote that all men by nature are equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty.
There's nothing new in the Declaration of Independence. If its arguments hadn't been familiar and understandable, it wouldn't have been a very powerful document of justification. What you might say was radical about it was, after all, it was an initial formal statement of the first of the modern revolutions against king government and an established legitimate constitution.
During the time, the Declaration did not include men without property, women, or slaves. But in the future, the Declaration would give them all a framework to support their argument for freedom and equality. This new declaration joined the American colonists together and confirmed their belief in independence. And it gave them the inspiration to face Britain's army, one of the greatest military powers in history.
To complement Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, TLC Elementary School suggests the following activity. Have students draw a map of the original 13 colonies as they looked in 1775. Then match the names of the Continental Congress delegates to the states that they represented. Segment 4, Sugaring.
My name is Jerry Pease, and I was born and raised here in East Orford, New Hampshire. My father taught me how to make maple syrup, and done it all my life. What makes sap run is cold nights and warm days. The old wives' tale about sugaring is that when the wind is in the west, the sap runs the best. When the wind is in the east, the sap runs the least. And it's true.
Hundreds of years ago, Native Americans discovered the craft of sugaring and introduced it to European settlers. Today, the sugaring tradition is carried on by sugar makers across North America, from New Hampshire and Vermont to Illinois and Wisconsin, and up into Canada, wherever sugar maple trees grow. The sugaring season begins each spring, when the days start to become warm, but the nights are still cold.
These are my grandkids, Johnny and Kirsten.
To collect the sap needed to make maple syrup, Jerry taps over 600 maple trees each year. Maple trees draw large amounts of water up through their roots when the ground first thaws in the spring. Water flows through the tree and mixes with sugars and amino acids stored in the wood to become sap. This sugary solution flows throughout the tree. Sap is drawn out of the maple tree by drilling a hole and placing a tap in it. The tap acts like a water spout, and a bucket is hung from the tap to catch and hold the sap. In addition to his traditional buckets and taps, Jerry has installed modern tubing lines to collect sap.
I started using tubing at least 10 years ago. Once you get it up, it saves a lot of work, you know, especially like the spring we had last year. Oh, the snow was clear up under your arms. Even with snowshoes, you sunk right in 1.5 feet, you know. It was, well, I wouldn't say it's one of the hardest years, but I wouldn't say it's the hardest, but one of the hardest years I ever sugared.
Sap doesn't run unless the temperature is just right, so Jerry must be patient. He passes the time by inspecting his lines. Plastic tubing taps are used the same way as traditional taps, but instead of the sap running off into a bucket, they are connected by a series of tubes. This line is over 500 feet long. Each tap is connected to one main line that runs into a gathering tank. Looks like the sap has started to run, so it's time to start gathering.
When I get ready to gather, sometimes the boys will come around, the grandkids will come around. Sometimes Tony goes with me, my wife. Okay, you guys will have to get one off over here. Come on, you can take the next one off.
As sugaring goes on, you're climbing over rocks or through the bushes or around trees, and I used to do that all in my younger days, but it's getting a little too difficult for me, so I count on the grandchildren.
Because sap is mostly water, Jerry will collect over 4,000 gallons this year to make about 100 gallons of syrup. Many years ago, Jerry's family used a horse and sleigh to gather sap where there were no roads. But times have changed. Today, more than half of Jerry's sap is collected by tubing lines. Jerry uses a sap vacuum pump to transfer the sap from the gathering tank to the tank on his truck. The tubing system has many advantages. Instead of gathering each bucket, Jerry is able to collect up to 100 taps worth of sap from each gathering tank. Tubing improves the sap quality because it is a sealed system, and the sap is protected from leaves and insects. Jerry pulls back on the vacuum tube to drain the last remaining drops of sap. Michael and Jennifer help their grandfather load up the truck and return to the farm. After a full day of gathering, it is time to move the sap from the truck to inside the sugar house. Sap is filtered as it runs to the holding tank. From there, it flows through a 1-inch tube to the storage tank inside the sugar house. The sugar house is the pride of the sugar maker. It is here where sap is boiled into pure maple syrup. Jerry loads wood into the arch, an oven fueled by firewood to heat large pans of sap. The fire must be constantly fed because Jerry must boil 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. The heat vaporizes the water and the sap is concentrated. This is called evaporation.
Syrup is getting pretty near ready. This is a scoop. I have in my hand here, and I just hold it up like that and check it. When it comes off in a good big apron like it's almost doing now, it's very close to syrup. But I check it with a big dial thermometer right on the side here. When that gets on 7, I open the spigot and draw it out. I think my favorite part of sugaring is boiling because I'm in here, you know, a lot of times by myself. I get the radio on and I can do my own thing. And I just like to see it boil. The harder it boils up, you know, the better I like it. We're gonna make some syrup.
Jerry pours hot syrup through a filter, so ash from the boiling process and other bits are removed. The syrup is stored here overnight. After a successful sugar day, it is a tradition to make maple sugar candy and sugar on snow. Theda and Michael watch the syrup as it heats to 236 degrees Fahrenheit. At the precise temperature, a small amount of syrup is scooped into a bowl and quickly stirred until it becomes thick. Then the syrup is poured into molds, where it quickly hardens into sugar candy. And if maple sugar candy didn't curb your sugar craving, you might enjoy sugar on snow. In this sugar bush favorite, boiled down syrup is poured over fresh snow where it hardens into a taffy-like candy. And with one twirl of the fork, a sweet tooth's delight. The morning after boiling, the syrup is ready for bottling. It has been stored overnight in the finishing rig, a container that evaporates the rest of the water from the syrup. The syrup is then graded by comparing its color to standard samples of light, medium, and dark maple syrup. The lighter the syrup, the higher the quality. The syrup must be poured into the containers at 180 to 190 degrees. The grade of the syrup is labeled on each bottle. The bottles are turned upside down so that the hot syrup seals and sterilizes the cap.
There's a lot of hard work in that half-gallon jug there.
As the warm days begin to outnumber the cold, the sugaring season will soon come to an end. But Jerry already looks forward to next spring and another season of making maple syrup.
To complement sugaring, TLC Elementary School suggests the following activity. Have students compare the prices of maple-flavored syrups and pure maple syrups. Discuss the reasons for the differences in cost. Do a taste test to determine what product the majority of the class prefers. Make a graph or table showing the results. Segment 5, Trains.
This is a train, a steam locomotive to be exact. Not many steam-powered trains still run in the United States, only about 50. Diesel trains have the upper hand now, but it was the steam engine that changed the course of American history. Trains took a long time to develop and catch on. The first steam train was built in Wales in 1804. It wasn't until over 20 years later, however, in 1825, that the first steam train was built in the United States. Even then, it was considered an oddity, a curiosity, not something to be taken seriously. An event that occurred in 1830 helped trains gain popularity in the United States. It happened in the city of Baltimore, where a train had been built, but one that was drawn by horses. A man named Peter Cooper had built a tiny engine known as the Tom Thumb. Mr. Cooper raced Tom Thumb against the horse-drawn rail car for 7 miles. It looked like the tiny engine would be the winner, but a belt slipped, the pressure dropped, and the Tom Thumb fell behind. The people of Baltimore, however, had seen what steam power could do, and they decided to build more locomotives. Today, their railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, is one of the oldest railroads in the country. People began to realize the potential of railroads. The faster and farther the railroads went, the faster and farther people wanted to go. In fact, all the way across the country. The California Gold Rush brought thousands of people west and made thousands more think about the idea. People needed a way to travel that was faster than a ship and safer than a wagon train. And during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln needed to find a way to link the country together. His answer was the Transcontinental Railroad. 2 new companies were formed to do the job. The Central Pacific Railroad began in California and went east. And the Union Pacific Railroad started in Omaha, Nebraska and went west. The job was very difficult. It took 6 long years and many hardships to lay the 1,775 miles of track. On May 10, 1869, rails from east and west met in Promontory Point, Utah. A golden spike was driven in, and the country was joined from the Atlantic to the Pacific by railroad. The hero of this grand adventure, the steam engine, is run by coal or wood. When burned, the fuel heats a boiler full of water to create steam. The steam moves the cylinders which turn the wheels. Here, the fireman shovels coal into the firebox. The engineer drives the train, steering it along the track. Inside the train, the conductor is in charge, taking tickets and helping passengers.
Thank you. Tickets? Tickets? Thank you, ma'am.
When steam trains reach the end of the line, they must be turned around so they can go back. The turntable is used for that purpose. Most turntables are now computerized and run by electricity. This one, however, is powered by muscle. The lifestyle for the average American in the late 1800s revolved around work and family. No one was in much of a hurry to be anywhere. What time of day it was hardly mattered. Consequently, the exact time differed from place to place. If traveling from Maine to California, you'd have to change your watch 20 times. Chicago had 6 time zones all by itself. But with the increased popularity of railroad travel, with people going so far and so fast, it became necessary to develop one system of time to keep the trains from running into one another. So on November 18, 1883, the railroads created our present 4 time zones. Has been transformed during the 20th century. This diesel-electric train is faster, sleeker, and safer than its predecessors. Diesels are by far the most common kind of train in the U.S. There are over 21,000 diesel trains in operation today. Modern trains are dependable and strong. The average length of a train is 71 cars. Most trains are used to haul freight. In fact, only 1% of train travel, that's 1 train in every 100, involves passengers. Passengers in the future will be able to travel much faster, thanks to an important new technology. This is the Transrapid, a train developed in Germany that has a cruising speed of more than 300 miles an hour. The Transrapid uses magnetic levitation, or maglev for short. The train moves along without wheels and without touching the track. It is levitated, or raised above the track through the power of magnets. Magnetic levitation trains are safe, fast, and good for the environment. But the old steam engines will always have a place in our hearts.
To complement trains, TLC Elementary School suggests the following activity. Have students listen to some of the famous railroad songs of the past, such as I've Been Working on the Railroad or Casey Jones. What is the message in these songs? Write a song for the fast, high-tech trains of the future. Segment 6, Cowboys.
Have you ever wondered what it would have been like to be a cowboy in the Wild West? To ride horses, to go on a trail drive, and live life on wide stretches of open land? It all began in the 1860s. During this time, cattle were raised in the pastures of the American plains to supply meat to the large cities of the East. So men were needed to take care of the cattle. These men became known as cowboys. But long ago, there were no cows in North America. In 1521, more than 450 years ago, the Spanish brought over the first cattle to what is now known as Texas. Then, for several hundreds of years, cows roamed the flat lands of Texas. But by 1870, ranchers had discovered that cows could thrive in the northern plains of the United States. So many cattle were moved to what is now known as Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and the Dakotas. These plains became one of the greatest cattle ranges in the world. And it was the cowboy, the caretaker of the cattle, who made this empire possible. Cowboys are a rare breed of American. There have never been more than 100,000 cowboys in the United States, but they have become a large and important part of our history. How do you recognize the real American cowboy? You can identify him by the clothes he wears. The cowboy wears boots, a hat, a bandana, chaps, spurs, and other clothes that are traditionally Western. There is a functional reason for each piece of clothing that the cowboy wears. The cowboy's hat has a wide brim to keep snow, rain, and sun off of his face. But the hat is not just for protection. He can use the hat to fan a fire, signal another cowboy, or scoop up water from a stream. The cowboy's bandana protects his neck from the sun, or it can be used to tie up a wound. The cowboy wears chaps, or seatless leather trousers, over his pants to protect his legs from thorny bushes. Cowboy boots also protect the cowboy from thorny bushes. The cowboy's boots have stitching in the leather to keep them stiff and prevent them from wrinkling around the ankles. The boots are pointed to make it easier to put his feet through the stirrups quickly. The boot heels also keep the cowboy's spurs off the ground. Spurs are the spiky points arranged in a circle that are attached onto the back of the boots. The cowboy uses the spurs to signal to the horse whether to stop or go. The cowboy's clothing protects him, but is also designed to help him do his job well. One of the cowboy's most important jobs is the trail drive, or moving the cattle from the western ranch to a railway station for shipment to the east. There is one group of cowboys from the IL Ranch in Nevada who still go on a trail drive with a horse-drawn chuck wagon, just like the cowboys did in the Old West. These Nevada cowboys are moving 3,000 head of cattle to the headquarters ranch. It takes 9 cowboys to handle this many cattle. The chuck wagon leads the trail drive. A chuck wagon is a covered wagon that carries the food for the cowboys during the trip. The front wheels are smaller than the back ones to make turning it easier. The second wagon is called a hoodlum wagon, and it carries spare bedding, saddles, and ropes. At the end of the day, the chuck wagon is sent ahead so the cook can begin to prepare the evening meal. This chuck wagon is just like the ones the cowboys used in the Old West. It has a water barrel that contains drinking water for the cowboys when they get thirsty. This man is the cook. Just like the Old West, cooks today are usually cowboys that are injured or too old to take care of cattle. The chuck wagon carries cooking tools, and it has drawers for flour, coffee, beans, bacon, and raisins. The body of the chuck wagon can be used as a table for the cook to prepare and serve the meals. This evening, the cowboys are eating beef. It is usually fairly tough, so the beef is stewed to make it easier to eat. After a good night's sleep, the cowboys begin a new day. This morning, they are drinking coffee and eating beef and pancakes for their breakfast. As soon as they are finished eating, they prepare to continue their journey. They pack up and saddle their horses. Most cowboys do not own their own horses. Each man rides a horse that belongs to the ranch owner, but every cowboy has his own saddle. Saddles usually weigh over 40 pounds and are very expensive. In the Old West, a saddle could cost anywhere from 1 month to 10 months' salary, or between $30 and $300. Today, a saddle costs between $200 and $1,000. During the trail drive, the cowboys move the cattle about 12 miles a day. At the front of the herd or group of cattle are the point riders. These cowboys lead the cattle in the right direction. The swing men are the cowboys who handle the cattle in the middle of the herd. At the end of the herd are the drag men. These cowboys keep slow cattle moving so they don't become lost. During the journey, the cowboys find time to braid. Cowboys are excellent braiders. They braid leather strips to make whips, hat bands, and ropes. And without ropes, a cowboy couldn't do his job. Roping cattle is one of the most important skills a cowboy can learn, but he must practice roping to become good at it. After many weeks of travel, the cowboys come to the end of the trail drive. They deliver the cattle safely to the headquarters ranch. This journey is over, but for these cowboys, there will be many more trail drives in the years to come. These Nevada cowboys have kept the traditions of the Old West alive. They are the only cowboys left who still ride in a trail drive with a horse-drawn chuck wagon. Just like the cowboys before them, These men love the trail drive and the life lived out on the wide open lands of the West. These men are real American cowboys.
To complement cowboys, TLC Elementary School suggests the following activity. Have students research the life of Buffalo Bill Cody and his famous Wild West shows. Discuss what Buffalo Bill did to enhance the reputation of the cowboy. Illustrate or reenact one of the skits from his Wild West shows in class. Segment 7, How the West Was Lost, The Trail of Tears.
In the early 17th century, the natives of North America discovered Europe. European settlers landed on their shores in the form of strangers from unknown lands across the vast ocean. Though weary from travel, these pilgrims were determined to survive and make a new and better home for themselves and their children. As increasing numbers of Europeans arrived, they spread across the country, establishing homesteads, claiming land for towns and villages. Over the next century, the new settlers rapidly expanded their presence in this, the ancient land of the tribes. As the new settlers encroached even further into Indian territories, they pushed the Native American civilization to the very brink of extinction and changed the natives' way of life forever. Cherokee people had once thrived and dominated in the region which was to become the American Southeast. By the end of the 1700s, the Cherokee had already lost 2/3 of their original land during a century of conflict with first the British and then the American government. Hoping to maintain their hold on what land remained to them, many Cherokee tried to accept the ways of their new neighbors. They began farming. Many lived in log cabins, used rifles, and worked with spinning wheels. Their hope was to live in harmony with the new American nation. Though some settlers were willing to live in peace with their Cherokee neighbors, other Americans did not want the Indians to be assimilated. By the beginning of the 1800s, most Americans, even those sympathetic to the Cherokees, like Thomas Jefferson, believed they should be moved west. Policy favored for the Cherokee was called removal. For the Cherokee, it was simply eviction. In response to this policy, the Cherokee set up a national government and used the United States Constitution as their model. As their principal chief, they chose John Ross.
He came from a mixed family, his father being from Scotland, and his mother being only a quarter-blood Cherokee, making him only 1/8 by blood. But he was raised in the Cherokee way.
The Cherokee Nation moved its national capital to northwestern Georgia. They called their capital New Echota. It was a symbol of Cherokee hope. For many Georgians, it was an ominous symbol of permanence. Georgia refused to recognize the Cherokee government. They outlawed the Cherokee Constitution and proclaimed the right to seize Cherokee lands at will. In the late 1820s, gold was discovered on Cherokee land. The strike set off a stampede of prospectors. Newly elected President Andrew Jackson proposed Indian removal legislation which would make it easier for Georgia to move Cherokees off of this valuable land. On May 23rd, Congress passed Jackson's Indian Removal Act, and Georgia swiftly passed its own legislation. Georgia's law stripped Cherokees of their civil rights and gave the nation 6 months to dissolve itself.
No Cherokee could mine gold on his own land. No Cherokee could testify in court against a white man. No Cherokee could carry weapons. The Cherokees were forbidden to meet in council.
John Ross took the Cherokee Nation's protests to President Jackson. Ross's appeal failed to persuade the president. But not all institutions of government were as indifferent to Indian rights as Jackson. The Supreme Court took an enlightened view of matters, and in March 1832, the court found Georgia's Cherokee legislation unconstitutional and void. Jackson ignored the ruling. He said the court, having made its decision, would have to find its own way to enforce it. Winter, 1835. Ross still believed he could fight removal. He returned to Washington with John Ridge, an influential Cherokee. Ridge had no official authority, but Jackson struck a deal with him. All Cherokee land east of the Mississippi was relinquished in exchange for $5 million. The deal was called the Treaty of New Echota. Jackson pushed the treaty through Congress by only a single vote. The Cherokees now had exactly 2 years to abandon the land of their ancestors. 2 years later, May 23, 1838. Time had run out for the Cherokee. A military roundup began. The Cherokee who were caught were taken to stockades. Here, more than 2,000 died due to a lack of adequate food, water, sanitation, and medical supplies. John Ross continued to fight for the Cherokee. He convinced Washington to allow the Cherokee to handle the immigration to the West themselves. Winter was closing in as the Cherokee prepared to leave the land they had loved, the land they had buried their fathers in, the land they had lived in, the land they had died for. As icy rains began to fall and the ground began to freeze, about 17,000 Cherokee men, women, and children prepared for their journey.
I read in stories that they ran up and they hugged the trees as they left. And every time I come back here, I look around and it's so beautiful here. You know that they grieved. You know that they did.
General Winfield Scott stood by with 7,000 troops as Cherokee men, women, and children carrying all that they owned began an 850-mile march to what is now the state of Oklahoma. Along the way, about 4,000 died, mostly children and the elderly. This was the tragic journey history would forever know as the Trail of Tears. In the end, the Cherokees' attempt at diplomacy and adaptation failed. Ultimately, America's policy of removal would cost the Cherokee an estimated 8,000 lives, every last acre of the Cherokee homeland.
To complement how the West was lost, the Trail of Tears, TLC Elementary School suggests the following activity. Have students trace the route that the Cherokee Indians took along the Trail of Tears. What would the journey have been like during that time of year? What obstacles might they have faced along the way? Discuss these questions in class.